Hello, I'm the Pink Phantom, and this is my podcast. Join me as I delve into the world of games and gaming, and especially old school RPGs. Together, let's voyage into the astral realm and check out my Phantom Thought. Wow, we're doing this again. The call-in episode 81, generated a lot more calls, and episode 82 also generated calls. I've got calls with Jason from the Nerds RPG Variety Cast, Daniel from the Bandits Keep Podcast and Bandits Keep Media Empire, FreeThrall from the Keep Off the Borderlands Podcast, Anthony from the Casting Shadows Podcasts, and Mirke from the Mirke the Meek Podcasts. Just a couple of quick explanatory notes. All those guys I mentioned, they either had multiple feedback, multiple files of feedback, multiple calls, or they had a feedback that had lots of different topics in it, or both. And so there's a lot of mixing and matching going on here. I'm trying to put everything together sort of by topic. So if it sounds kind of non sequitur, you hear people talking about this is my second call, or this is my next call, and you haven't heard the first call, that's just because of the way I put it together. If things sound like they're cut off a little bit, where I chopped up a call, that's because of the way I edited it. And the second note is, in the last call-in episode, EOTB called in talking about the granularity in playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and I put that part into the episode, but somehow my response ended up just staying on my desktop, and I noticed it when I was organizing files for this episode. So the first thing you're going to hear is that feedback from EOTB, and then my response to it. So if you think I've heard this before, if you listen to the last call-in episode, you have. And then after that, we're going to get into more feedback talking about the term authentic gaming used in Muster, and how the author used it, and how different people have interpreted that and looked at that. And then I'll be back to tell you what's next. So let's get into the calls.
Hey, Phantom, this is EOTB from the CAG podcast. I just was listening to episode 80. It's the first one I've listened to. Great episode, but I started calling with a few thoughts. On granularity and AD&D and mastery of it and all that stuff like that, just a quick note on that. I've noticed a lot of people think that if granularity is present in a game, it has to be understood and used and memorized before you play it, and that's not true. The number one rule in AD&D, Gygax says this over and over, is run it fast. Shed as much granularity as necessary for you to run it fast. You don't master AD&D before you run it. You master it by running it before you're ready, and then just folding in more and more of the granularity as the overall game becomes unconsciously familiar. So never stop or slow down play to look up granularity. Just look at the section in the D&G conducting the game. It talks about assigning reasonable probabilities for stuff that's, not in the rules. Just give it a flat percentage, roll the dice, and move on. That's also what you should do when you can't remember granularity. Just go ahead and move on. What you're doing with solo stuff, it's fine. But I'm just talking about if somebody's worried about running the game for people. So regarding book organization, look at the PDF bookmarks on your Player's Handbook and DMG. They're mostly the same bookmarks. The DMG is written as an appendix to the Player's Handbook, and it follows the Player's Handbook's organization. So if you want the easiest read of AD&D, cut your Player's Handbook pages into the DMG and the same bookmark sections at the beginning of that bookmark section, so that you're reading the Player's Handbook pages first and then the DMG pages after that within the same section. That'll make the game flow a lot better. I've got a couple of other thoughts, but I'll probably make separate calls for those because I'm running out of time. Talk to you later.
I agree 100%. You don't want to get bogged down looking things up, trying to find the exact rule when you're in the middle of a game session with other people. Absolutely. And it's, it works better that way. In solo play, it's a good way to learn. In solo play is you can stop and go and go back and look through the books, especially if, I've got like PDFs for 4 different books or 5 different books up at the same time that I'm running the game, so that I can flip through and learn where those things are. And of course, that's why things like DM screens with all the proper charts and everything are also useful for a game session, because you've got what you need at hand and you can keep that flow going. That flow of the game, that's what you're there for. And unless it's just a situation where maybe you were going to take a break anyway, give everybody a chance to go to the bathroom, grab a snack, whatever. There's no point in just stopping the game and start flowing through the books unless you want. And that's a lot of course, the discussion and complaints you hear sometimes about one game or another game, or maybe just a particular session, that somebody didn't know their character, they didn't know their character sheet, the DM was caught unprepared for direction that the characters went into, and so then the game had to come to kind of a stop until that could be remedied or adjudicated, and then the game could to continue. You hear that a lot in social media circles. You read about it on blog posts. You hear about it on podcasts. So that's very good advice, and you hear it often, but you can never hear it often enough, right? In terms of the organization of the DMG, first of all, I'd never looked at DMG versus Player's Handbook, and when you said that, I went back and again got my PDFs up and looked at. Yeah, there were a lot of sections, and they're all in basically the same order. There's maybe different sections in between some of them, and they're there. So that's pretty neat. That's pretty interesting. And of course, with text documents, you can have the opportunity to insert and move and match things like that. I think I haven't gone back and listened to that part of my previous podcast, but I think when I was talking about the organization, I probably didn't make it clear, but I was thinking about when I was doing some calculations with morale, and I was using the morale rules, and I was using reaction rules, and I was using the loyalty and morale rules that are under the henchman section. Those are 3 different sections of the book, but I was using them together, so there's a lot of flipping, and some of the items are supposed to go with some of the sections. Some of the modifiers from the loyalty section are supposed to go with the morale section and things like that. So you have that book distance between those things that are supposed to work out. That was a very specific thing, and and there's just in terms of DMG organization, there's a lot of places where Gary will say you will all reference the rules previously mentioned, but he doesn't say where. So you have to either already know where they are or go for a search for them to find what he's talking about, what he's referencing, because it's not a well referenced within the book itself if there's related sections. But yeah, that whole thing about the DMG and the Player's Handbook, that's good advice there. That's something very interesting. Thank you for pointing that out.
Hey Pink Phantom, Spencer here. And I wanted to respond to the responses about the use of the term authenticity and how it got me reflecting on why I didn't have a reaction to the use of the term. I think it's because of the context in which it was presented, as you say, as the opposite of what he described as a media presentation. Rather than him talking about an authentic style of play, I understood him to be defining play itself, in the sense that the activity he was presenting it in opposition to doesn't include enough room for player agency to qualify as authentic play. That's kind of how I understood it. I don't know if that adds anything to discussion, or maybe I've just repeated your own response to those responses. But yeah, really interesting how Yeah, I didn't have that same reaction that Jason and Che had. Hey, Pink Phantom, Spencer again. I just heard EOTB making the exact, well, seemingly the opposite point to what I was saying regarding authenticity. Coming at it from the opposite end, what is play without the game, without rules, without any kind of guidelines, being inauthentic too, because there are no stakes. Yeah, really good point there. I guess meaning that the authentic play in terms of RPGs and wargaming too is that middle ground, that kind of magical spot between being told a story and completely unstructured play beyond the bounds of it being a game. Yeah, just really interesting stuff.
Hey, Jason here. Really enjoyed your call-in show. I think the authentic and inauthentic got me in the feels, and I should be better than that, so I apologize. EOTB did a great job breaking it down, and when he talked about it regarding the analogy with like football, it doesn't sound offensive at all. So I don't know. Maybe like I say, it just got me in the feels. So sorry about that. But great job answering all that.
Hey, Pink Phantom, Daniel calling in. It's weird. I thought I called in about the authenticity and about the pummeling. Funny. And I looked at my phone and I didn't because the recording sounded terrible because I was driving. So, it's weird because I cringed at that word too. And I think it's really interesting because certain adjectives will feel judgy to certain people, I guess. And while you're right that they did kind of define it, I still don't know, not buying it. And then on top of it, I feel like that the call you got about football, ETOB's call, almost like set it in my mind. Like, you're going to tell me if I'm on the street playing football with my friends that it's not authentic because we're not keeping score? I mean, that just sounds silly to me. Like, it's a game. But, again, I look at these things much different than maybe the writer does. I think it's hard to use the right words. I agree with you. I've listened to many podcasts by people I really respect, and they will say things like richer, or I even once heard somebody say something to the effect of they felt bad for people that couldn't get into in-character immersion. Really? You feel bad for me? So I totally get like how certain things can grab us different ways. So I don't think that it's bad that it doesn't grab you that way, but it definitely grabbed me that way. Both those statements, it's not authentic. Everything I do is authentic. It's authentic if I'm enjoying it, if my friends are enjoying it, and that's that. But again, I'm interpreting authentic as a completely different thing, clearly, than this writer. Overall, great episode, as always. I really enjoyed all the calls and people's thoughts on different things. And it's funny, right? Because the point you make about a Twitter post, for instance, right? Like, if I certainly would have seen if somebody had tweeted and said, well, to play in a railroad style is inauthentic, that would have 100%, set me probably to reply to it. But to read it in the book the way you did, I just thought, I don't agree with what this person's saying. It seems kind of elitist, but we 100% get elitists on both sides. We get them on the deep immersion. We get them on the play the game by the rules. We get them on the play the game however you want. So, I mean, it's just the way it is. And I think that when we project ourselves out there in social media or we write a book, it's good to take a point of view. I remember, I think I said that when I had taught on my show that really, like, the rules to my game are just have fun with your friends. But I said, you can't just write that down and say, here's my game. So I think we have to take a point of view, or if we want people to play in ways that we're trying to create at our table. And I think that's totally valid. I wouldn't use those words. I don't think that they're very good words to use for that kind of thing, because I do think they could rub people the wrong way. I also wouldn't use richer. I wouldn't use, was it unsanitary? No, that's not correct. But anyways, I wouldn't use those words either. I think all those words are they very much bring up something very specific to my mind. And because of that, I think that it would maybe trigger thoughts in other people to that. Anyways, That's a pretty long message. I hope that it makes sense since it was kind of a combo. Really enjoyed the episode. Looking forward to your next one. I'll talk to you soon.
And then I guess to just briefly speak on what Che and Jason raised, and that I decided not to talk about in my call, is the notion of the terminology of authentic and inauthentic. And I get what you are saying totally. The writer, who I don't believe is writing in his first language, is trying to describe a particular way to play and defined very clear boundaries for it, and playing inside those boundaries is going to be authentic, and playing outside of those boundaries is not going to be authentic. And I will certainly run into the same sort of thing in my discussions, where I want maybe to discuss playing on the story layer of play. Like, we're going to play to create story on purpose, which means we need to do the following things. And if we don't do the following things, we're not going to be able to do that. Or in my own personal games, because I'm not one to play on the story layer, because that doesn't suit my preferences, then, how do we play for an in-character experience? And if we have deviation from the limitations that allow that sort of play, then we wind up with play that is not that in-character experience. It's something else. So, I get what may have been said.
That's a lot of great calls on this subject, a lot of back and forth, a lot of good viewpoints in there. I think I do agree that some of the choice of terminology of authentic and inauthentic is probably due to the author is from Finland. They say it in the book that they're from Finland. They mention it several times, and they're coming at it from a context of the Finnish gaming scene, and they were exposed more to the more, say, Americanized gaming scene, RPG scene, that I think a lot of the internet culture is built around. They were exposed to that through the internet, and they fell into the idea of old school play. They mentioned that in the book, later in life, later in their hobby experience. And again, so, being from another country, being from English, being their second language, which is, if they have the second language, it's one more than I have. And so, if you're speaking a different language, you're going to take things literally. And I think they probably looked at taking what they were thinking about how to describe the style, how to describe play, and the differences between this style of play and other styles of play, and what they were trying to accomplish with it, that authentic was a good word to pick. It is a word that in contexts can be a very judgmental word, and I think we're all very sensitive to that. And I think that's part of a modern mindset. It's part of a social media mindset. It's part of, unfortunately, it's a part of mindset in a lot of nerd culture, where more and more people take criticism personally, where people see differences and attack the differences instead of just recognizing the differences and pointing them out and exploring what those differences are. And you see that in a lot of fandoms, where things change, ownership changes, writers change, producers change, publishers change, and things change, and people don't like change. They like what they have been comfortable with, what they have played for 2 years, 5 years, a decade, and then it changes and it changes again and it moves away. And so we're all very sensitive to that overall as a in geekdom, in nerddom. And so I think it is understandable that, authentic and inauthentic, that would raise some hackles to make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. But I do think in this case, the combination of, it's a book. This is something they put a lot of effort into, and it's a book that's meant to define and kind of wall off. This is a different style of play that I don't see a lot, and this is what I want to get from it. And these are the descriptors I've chosen. But it can be a very judgmental word. But I do think for me, it doesn't make the bar of this is an insensitive person, or this is a person that's being judgmental of the rest of the hobby, but so much as just trying to define their little bubble of hobby that they enjoy the most. But it's a lot of great calls, guys. I really appreciate all of that. This next group of feedback is about the pummeling rules from the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide. We're going to hear from Jason and from Daniel.
I need to look back at the AD&D pummeling rules and all that and do some more research. So I'll probably give you another call on that. I want to say when we were playing, we were having to roll each time like you read it. But I want to look more into the way that EOTB described it, because that sounds wonderful. And I'm definitely going to run it that way when I run AD&D next, because I love the idea of those combo strikes. Anyhow, I will talk to you later. Take care. Hey, Jason, one last call. So I got a chance to look at the pummeling table in the DMG, and I see what EOTB is saying, and darn it, he nailed it. So if you look at the pummeling table, some of those have a single asterisk next to them. And underneath it says, series ends, determination of next strike must be made. So if you get one of those asterisks, then you do have to roll again to hit. But if you don't get that asterisk, then you just, when it says strike again, you just roll damage again. I see what he's saying there, and darn it, he's right. AD&D is one of those games where it definitely helps if somebody shows you what's going on as opposed to you reading it yourself. Okay, that's enough for me. Take care.
Part 2, pummeling. Man, it was so good. I actually said in my original message what Jason did. I'm waiting for the overbearing now. That's the most complicated one. I think that's where you have to figure the weight difference. That's so good. Because you know what's great about that though? Because when you look at that, in fact, quick story, I was running 5th edition and I had one player that was always grappling stuff. And grappling is super vague in 5th edition. It's you can grapple stuff that's well, I think you can grapple anything, but you can grapple stuff up to one size larger than you. And I just thought that was crazy because one size larger could be like a horse, to a human. So I was like, you know what, if you want to do a lot of grappling, let's dig into these overbearing rules. And I just showed them it with the weight and stuff, and they were like, oh yeah. So I was like, how about this? I'm going to give you some penalties here if you want to try to grapple something big. I mean, I know you're strong, but that's a little silly. I actually also agree with your interpretation of pummeling as far as strike, meaning, again, rolling again. And it's funny because that's one of the great things about these older games in my mind is that we can all look at the same line and interpret it slightly different. And frankly, that's good. I like that. As long as the table agrees with it. I actually really love the idea of the, combination, almost, right. I think you might have called it Street Fighter. I love that idea. But I think if I was reading it, and I know that when I've used it in the past, I've done what you've done. So I'm curious. I want to reread that part again. And I got to get more pummeling in my game. It's such a fun system.
Having gone back and looked at the rules myself, I stand by my interpretation. It's a very literal interpretation. From my point of view, I did see the asterisk and the note attached to it that Jason mentioned, and the non-asterisk comments, the non-asterisk results on that table say strike again. And again, before that table, in between the sections on adjustments for to hit, and then getting to the section for the adjustments to determine damage on that table, it does use the term strike, and it says for each strike you determine if it hits and then damage. And while Gary has been known to be loosey-goosey with his terms, he used the same term in that section and on the table, strike again, and prior to that, the section that said, for each strike, you determine if it hits and then determine damage if it does. So to me, I think it's a very straightforward interpretation to say that for each strike, you have to roll to hit. And that it's not just one hit per attack. You get 2 attacks per round when you're pummeling, and within each attack there can be multiple blows, multiple strikes, and I believe that's the way that Gary is writing it there. So I agree with both Jason and Daniel. What EOTB said how to do it, where if you roll to hit once and it says strike again, you just keep rolling for damage as long as you keep getting that strike again roll. I think that's a great idea. I like the idea of combos. The idea of something is something you see in mixed martial arts. It's something you see in the boxing ring, and it's something you see in video games, fighting games, where you get a strike in and you get another and another and another, and you get that combo attack in. So that's a great idea. And I'm not saying I won't ever do that, but I'm saying the rules as written and the way I ran it, I think that's the way the rules are written. I don't know what else to say about it. This next piece of feedback, we're going to hear from Anthony talking about wargaming, his experience with board games, historical ward games.
Hello, Pink Phantom. It's Anthony calling in, and for once I'm not on the road. Surprise, surprise. And I just wanted to call in to, connect with what you were saying about how people react to a lot of different war games. And I can definitely confirm that as well. When I was in university, most of my wargaming was done with members of the history department. And they came to those games fully loaded with all kinds of fuel for their imaginations, whereas they're introducing the games to me and I'm not prepared, right? I'm not particularly versed in whatever battle this particular game represents or what the cultures represented are, or even really what the weapon technologies are. I'm learning that as I'm playing. So I'm kind of drowning and trying to make my way toward shore. So I'm very focused on how the game works in these situations. Whereas they, like you say, are learning it, or they're reveling in it, or all those specific triggers that make an immersive experience possible. And in those large-scale battles, generally speaking, I think the only in-character immersive experience these players might have is the notion of the general, right? Putting themselves in that position. But like I said, immersion is more than just that most popular notion of immersing in a character's perspective. There is immersing in the activity of directing your battle, the immersive experience of, like I was experiencing, of focusing on and using the rules, deeply involved in the tactics or the strategies of whatever particular game we were playing, that kind of thing. There's so many ways to have our attention narrowed down to a point where it excludes other things. So anyway, good points there. In the wargaming context, I don't know about you, but I've encountered pushback when someone has asked me to play through an historical scenario. You play one side of a real battle, I play the other side of a real battle, and we play it out pretty much in the hope that it turns out the way it did in history, versus playing it to find out what we bring to that situation and trusting in the rule set to give us an appropriate way to test our skills as if we were there, that kind of thing. There is that sense of, I have to make the decisions that were made in history, and that's less fun than trying something crazy. But anyway, this call is long enough. I'm enjoying the discussion. Take care.
I have run into what you're talking about there, Anthony. I've run into it in a couple of ways. One is somebody wanting an opponent that's going to play a historical role so that they can explore what if the other side did not follow the historical path, to see if it would yield a different result. Just a way to explore for one side and not the other, so you have consistency on one side, the historical decisions made on one side and not on the other. The other way I've seen it, and I think the more common way I've seen it, is using whether or not you get a historical result as a measure of how viable the game is for the sort of exploration I was just talking about. Because there's the idea that you want it to be simulative. There's a lot of discussion in that board game wargaming section of the hobby about simulation. Does it simulate or emulate the era or the type of warfare it's supposed to be well, and does it give you historical results? Does it result in? Is it realistic? Can you trust the results that you get? That the outcome would be a possibility, and there's a lot of discussion around. Well, if a game is very simulative of the era or of the campaign or of the battle, that it should yield a historical result or near enough to it more often than not, maybe far more often than not, maybe 6 out of every 10 plays, maybe 8 out of every 10 plays. It depends on who you ask. You should get that historical result. So even if you make different decisions, it's going to be an outlier, and it's not just the dice just it's not swingy. To use a term, it's not swingy where, okay, you might get a historical result, or if the dice go nuts, you might not, or if you just make wild decisions, non-historical decisions. I shouldn't say wild decisions. Just because it's not historical decisions doesn't make it wild. But if you make different decisions, it yields a non-historical result. Or is the way it's set up, is it going to tend towards that historical result unless you really think it through and you have a really good plan and a really good way to sort of work against those historical forces that are built into the game? That's the way I most often see it, where it's a judgment of, well, if you never get a historical result, how good a game is it for that battle, for that campaign? But I know exactly what you're talking about. There's in that, that intellectual pursuit of understanding history, there's the notion that if it's going to have value doing that, you should end up with a historical result a lot of the time when you play that particular game. And now we're getting to some calls based on my most recent episode before this one, episode 82, where I didn't have any call-ins because I had a call-in episode before that, and I covered muster and a little update on my Tales of the Dragon Slayers campaign.
Hey, Pink Phantom, this is Mirke. Just wanted to say thank you for answering my AD&D nonsense, I guess we'll call it that. And also, just thanks for going through muster. It certainly is thought-provoking for me. I have picked it up. You mentioned it was free, and I will. I'm sure I will read it after you are done with your read-through and analysis. I'm enjoying it very much. This past one, mustering a dialogue, is I guess it comes down to a matter of trust and maturity amongst players and GM. And I'm guessing you might have to start off with plenty of conversations, especially if it's like a new group you haven't played before or whatever. Trying to establish the goals, establish your approach to dungeon mastering. But after a while, once everyone is getting used to each other and you've been addressing things as they come up, I'm guessing things will start working more smoothly from there. At least that's been my experience. When I first started with a group, we did probably like a 1.5 to 2 year campaign. And towards the beginning, there was more conversations and discussions about how to approach certain rules or certain subjects. But by the end of it, we were humming along as a group. And then we did another campaign afterwards. And once again, even with new characters, there didn't really need to be too many conversations about rules or rulings or anything like that. The author also mentions infantilizing your players, and I find that interesting with my experience with my girls. My philosophy has been, or my approach has been, to play with them as if I am a player and I'm more just guiding, facilitating the procedures and the rules more than dictating how things go. This works very well because we've been relying so heavily on rolling against random tables and then also rolling fate die when we have questions. So there isn't really that much decisions that I'm making and imposing on them, and they know it. And it certainly has been empowering. Like my interview with my daughter, she feels like she could GM essentially. Like if she just was a little bit more familiar with the rules, she would feel rather comfortable imitating that play style. So I see that as a win, and kind of the exact opposite of what the author was saying concerning infantilizing your players.
Hey, Jason here, listening to your latest episode. As far as this reading a muster, the question of rulings and players' involvement in those rulings and discussion of the rulings, yeah, I think a healthy discussion is a good thing. And, of course, ideally, some of these things, like the idea that the longbow, would all be handled in the... I think the important part is it probably should all happen outside of the game. So we shouldn't be stopping the game to do these kind of discussions. If there's something really gross and negligent that happens or major that happens during the session, you could stop the session. But generally, I hope players would be able to wait until at the end of the session to discuss it. So you're not ruining the flow of the session, especially these days where a lot of us play in 2 or 3 hour online sessions. You don't want to stop the session and lose half an hour to a rules discussion. But I don't see any issue with discussing rulings. And I think for the most part, the days of the DM, putting their foot down and, this is this and no questions allowed are well over. Not that necessarily those ever existed. But anyhow, I'll talk to you soon.
Hey, Pink Phantom, Daniel Bennett's keep calling in. 2 things. I'll start with the thing I love, which is your actual play. Had so much fun listening to it. I actually really like the dungeon crawls. It's like I typically listen to them when I'm walking the dog, and you'll say things like they go 40 feet down the corridor, they bar this, spike this door, they do this, and I picture it in my head. It's great. It's really well narrated. So thanks for that. Really, really cool. I also just love how having like the different magic items and stuff makes a big difference in how much stuff you seem to find. Obviously because you're narrating it in whatever, 10 minutes, it feels like, in 10 minutes you found 3 magic items and all this treasure, but I know that was probably, an hour or 2 hours, whatever, of playing. Now the kind of thing I didn't love, I think I've locked into the idea that I just don't necessarily like the language use in muster very much. So kind of tying back into my last call, which was about authentic, he seems to keep drifting into this idea that in games are telling dungeon masters to basically be authoritative and, hide things. And I get that, and I guess we've talked about this before, maybe he's very specifically referring to AD&D, but he very much seems to throw the entire old school, way of playing into effectively the Dungeon Master's Guide from AD&D, which, to my feeling is written at least partially tongue-in-cheek, as I've talked about before. We were all Dungeon Masters. Nobody hid the Dungeon Master's Guide from the players. I mean, I think that's ridiculous. But beyond that, he seems to lay out this idea that either you are authoritative and the players can't know anything and they do your bidding, or you give them the right when they come to you and want to change something, you just let them have it. Well, guess what? That's the same thing. If I'm allowing them to break the rules or do something because they argue for it, I'm still the one that's allowing them to do it. So I don't think that they're actually changing anything there. I think I do understand where they're coming from, though, and it is actually more or less how I play. I always listen to my players. We always make decisions together. I think that's the best way to play, and I think it is the way that most people play based on my limited experience. I've probably played with, I don't know, maybe 100 different people over the course of 5-6 years. I don't think I've ever played at a table where somebody was so hardcore. You can't look at the rules. You do it my way. I'm the dungeon master, or leave. I've seen videos where people say that, but I often laugh at that and go, yeah, you wouldn't be keeping players if you, if you said, I'm the dungeon master, that's why. Yeah, that's a good way to not have a table. So, again, I don't know. Maybe back in the day, there were so few people running games that you could get away with that, but I didn't experience it because I played with my friends and we weren't jerks to each other, any more than kids are. And as an adult, I wouldn't put up with it, obviously. I would just kind of side-eye the person and be like, okay. So, yeah, I find that because they lay it out like that, it puts a really weird and bad taste in my mouth for what they seem to perceive as old school way of playing, which I don't think is very accurate. So, anyways, that's why I love listening to you talk about it, because I feel like if you just took all the things, if you didn't read Muster out loud, as it would be, and you just talked about the things you talked about without me knowing it came from that and hearing the actual original text, I would agree with like 99% of everything. That's the funny part about it. So I really am convinced it's just the way it's written, and I try to kind of look past that. But man, there's just moments where I'm like, really? Like, who plays like that? Like you're telling us, oh, we should be fair with our friends. Yeah, no dur. Like, who isn't, But maybe there are people like that. So I suppose if people have stories like that, call into the Pink Phantom. I'll get all the stories on your podcast. Anyways, another great episode. Thanks so much. I hope I'm not coming off as negative. I don't mean to. I'm just kind of, like for some reason, every once in a while, and it's like I say, it's tough because generally speaking, the book, again, based through your lens, is good. I like the some of the ideas, and I like how you present them. I feel that I'm struggling sometimes with the way the author writes them. So that's just me. I'm really liking what you're doing. I'm hoping that. I didn't say this last time, and I wanted to. That EOTB said that if you take the bookmarks from the player's handbook and the DMG and you kind of like smush them together into a giant book, it would all be well organized. Man, I need to do that. That sounds, if that works well for me, I will like forever be throwing that out there with, obviously crediting EOTB, because if that lines it up right, that would be fantastic. It's kind of like if you think about Basic and Expert, if you take each book separately, sometimes people find that it's, it's hard to find something, you don't know which book it is. But if you actually stuck them together into one book, like separated by sections, because that's exactly how they are, it would actually be really well organized. And then you wouldn't need to spend $100 on OSE. So there you go. Get yourself 2 PDFs and do it. So I'm going to look at my PDFs of the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I will definitely try to do that. And if you haven't done it before I do it, then I'll call back in and let you know if it worked out. So thanks, EOTB, for that. That's amazing, and I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, the highway or the My Way or the Highway GM, that's something you see talked about from time to time. It's a trope, right? It's a fairly common trope, and it is used a lot of times to paint old school style play in a bad way because it's associated with that old school style. I think a lot of it is because when you read the stories or hear the stories about that sort of thing, it's usually in the context of, the pre-internet era, and probably in a lot of cases in the sort of the satanic panic era, where a lot of parents were, because of the satanic panic, were not interested in letting their kids even explore D&D, where if you were interested in that and you found a group, it was probably the only group you were going to find. Or if you lived in a small town, or if you lived in a very outlying area where there weren't a lot of gamers, you really didn't have a lot of choice who to game with. You could either game with them or not game. And so if you ran into this kind of dictatorial style of, it's my way, it's my rules, I'm going to make the rulings, and if you don't like it, get out, then that's where I think those stories come from. And I think they do have to come from somewhere. It's such a widespread trope. It can't have just come up out of the zeitgeist of the RPG hobby and just this collective imagination horror story that we tell ourselves. I think it's very much like, but I think it is very much like the idea of the story of the GM who's just running the game to play out his own novel that you hear. That's probably the flip side. The side that people are try to use to kind of push back on an old school style play is the dictatorial DM style. And then on the flip side, the people who try to push back at a new school style of play, the more modern styles of play, if you will, is the notion of the GM that has just written his fantasy novel, and he's making you play it out, and he's railroading you and limiting your choices. So I think those two tropes are flip sides of the for lack of a better term, and this is a very dramatic way of putting it, the war for the soul of the RPG hobby between old school and more modern, and that and the idea of safety tools. I think those two things, story gamer, dictatorial gamer, story GM, dictatorial GM, and safety tools. No, you don't need safety tools if you're adults. Those two things, I think, are the big separators of the hobby, the sort of flashpoint issues, if you will. But yeah, I think there have to have been something for it to have existed for this long. I think there had to have been people who played like that. And I think it could have been just a result of the way the game was when it was, even when it wasn't, you didn't have the satanic panic. It was a nerdy thing. It was not accepted as well. It was put together. I mean, this is probably more 80s than 70s. I think 70s, when it was closer to its wargaming rules, it was probably a little more acceptable. But yeah, I think it had to come from somewhere. There probably were GMs like that back in the day because they could be. Whereas now, you go online and find a game somewhere else. And we're going to finish off with another call from Mirke.
I just finished up the Tales of the Dragon Slayer section on the latest episode. It's cool to see how you've got the recurring monsters happening. I remember you calling into my podcast to say your process for establishing the recurring monsters that it will be in the dungeon based on percent in layer. And I like seeing how that's working out now in the dungeon right now. So I'm throwing down a vote, if you're willing, to peel back the curtain on your process some more, your solo gaming process. I know you talked about how you calculated all the morale stuff for the gnolls and the trolls and the orcs and all that. And I found that fascinating, even though I was marveling at how crazy it is, at least initially to my mind. I would be curious to see some more. And maybe you've already done that in previous episodes, and I haven't gotten through your back catalog yet. But, just point me in that direction, or consider doing that some more, if you're willing. Anywho, thanks for the episode, and take care.
Well, thank you, Mirke. I have tried to kind of open the book on what I've been doing from time to time. Unfortunately, a lot of those have been in response to call-ins, and I haven't really detailed those in the show notes to say exactly what I'm talking about in the call-ins. But now looking back on some of the campaign content, I've done episode 68. I talked about how I figured out whether or not the merchant caravan would challenge the gnolls. That was a lot of sort of how-to. There wasn't really a lot of, I guess, plot development, for lack of a better term. Episode 70 was a campaign summary, so there may be some stuff in there. I don't remember exactly what I went in there. It may have just been, summing up the story so far. I think that in episode 61, I went over sort of how I was doing the dungeon. Probably a lot of it was what I talked about in terms of setting up the dungeon with recurring characters, recurring creatures, I believe was part of the episode, but I think there may have been more to it than that. Episode 56, I talked about orcs setting up a lair at the Dragon Cave. So there was a lot of figuring up how long they would have to put together a palisade and dig a ditch and stuff like that for defense, because the hill giants that the party had encountered there had showed up right before the orcs got there, and then they were going to be coming back. And I rolled, kind of process rolled to see if the hill giants would come back, and if so, when, looking for food there because the party had fed them once before. What I tend to do is I tend to share if I find an interesting mechanic that either I didn't know or only knew of kind of tangentially before, that I find in the DMG or maybe another book, something like, I don't think I've talked about weather generation. I may have talked about it once because I think I remember Daniel asking about it. But I think I just mentioned it to Daniel actually because he was talking about weather and weather generation in the Wilderness Survival Guide that came out for first edition. I don't think I've really gone into depth about that. I've been using that a little bit. That's something I should discuss later. But yeah, that's something I intend to do, is to talk about my process from time to time. I've actually been spending a lot of time lately kind of revamping how I'm organizing things to keep better track of stuff, because the party's generated treasure and they've got expenditures, and they've generated a lot of XP with a lot of these delves and stuff they've been doing, and there's a lot going on. There will be a lot going on kind of in the future. It's reaching a point, or it has reached a point in the campaign where there are a lot of things that are kind of happening at the same time. And really, my basic process has been to see when something occurs, whether it's rolling up an encounter on a random table, or the aftermath of a battle or the aftermath of a dungeon delve. How will the results of that affect the wider world? Because the party has dealt with a lot of creatures. Some of them they've taken prisoner. Some of them they have simply released into the world just to get them out of the dungeon. They weren't necessarily hostile, or they didn't necessarily have to be hostile. So they got them out of the dungeon, released them in the world. So that's something that could come back. I had a battle between nomads and bandits that the party had just kind of briefly brushed by or barely touched, and they ended up having a battle. And so there's, what were the repercussions of that, or something that could ring down through the campaign, and just in general things like that. I guess one thing I don't know that I did mention it because it's how the Knolls ended up with all those creatures working with them when the merchant caravan tried to push through a few episodes back, is that I haven't just been using the random tables for the party, the random monster generation for the party. Whereas before, when I started early on and realized the party was going to be kind of at two locations, because they were going to be transporting the treasure, but there were also, some of them were going to be at the Dragon Cave with the remaining treasure, I started rolling, essentially double random encounters to see, does something show up at the cave? Does the party encounter something moving? And then once the party actually had stashed some treasure away, is something going to show up at the keep and maybe find and raid the treasure while the party's not there, or as the party's putting it away? And then I expanded that to when the Knolls took over the keep, the other keep. Who were they going to encounter? That's how they ended up with another band of Knolls and hobgoblins and orcs and ogres and bugbears. So what I've tried to do is expand beyond the notion of it's just centered on the party, part of a wider world. Eventually, there will probably be multiple parties in this world, because when you look at the rules, and I know I meant to talk about this before, but I don't know if I actually have on the podcast. Edgar is a druid, and Sir Gus is a paladin. Well, one of the things in the rules is that paladins have to associate with good creatures, good characters, and good creatures, whether it's chaotic good, neutral good, lawful good. They have, on a permanent basis, they have to associate with them. They can associate with neutral characters, but only on a limited basis. So at some point, Edgar and Gus have to part ways. And, where's that line drawn? I think I have talked about this on the podcast. I've done so much lately. There's been a lot going on, a lot of good call-ins and stuff, so I'm losing track of exactly everything I've talked about. But so things like that I try to think about, and what aspects will that have, and Edgar, if Edgar departs, and that's probably the way it's going to go, is Edgar will depart, because really having a keep and lots of treasure around is more. It's not really a Paladin thing, because they give away a lot of treasure too, but it's more in what he's, establishing law and order than what Edgar will be for, which would be more for, balance and all that we associate druids with. So I imagine Edgar will probably be the one to go, and following him will be part as well. What is he doing? So that will be another line of things. That's one thing I'm trying to do is organize things a little better, so that I can see, okay, we've got gnolls here. What are they doing? We've got orcs over here. What are they doing? Edgar's over here. What's he doing? Sir Gus and Katya over here. What are they doing? What's Cudgel doing? Cudgel is on his way to the fort to train. What will he run into in that regard? So that is something I'm going to do, and I need to get a little more organized in how I do it. I need to do a better job, because I've only had one, like I mentioned, I've only had one episode where I kind of summarized what's been going on, and I need to do that a little more often. That's something I really appreciate about the Tale of the Manticore podcast, is about every 10 episodes or so, he does an update episode to bring people up to speed if they've missed episodes, or just to remind people of what's going on, so they have a better understanding of what future episodes will hold. So thank you very much for the request. Thank you so much for your call. Thanks to everyone that called into the podcast. When I did a call-in podcast, I didn't think I'd be doing another one so soon. So I certainly appreciate you guys listening, and I appreciate you guys calling in and responding and giving feedback and asking questions and giving opinions, because that's a great thing about this format of podcast that I've adopted after listening to so many others do it. And I want to say thanks to everyone who listens that doesn't call in. It's gratifying to see where the podcast was to where it is now, and it's not a massive podcast by any reason, but it's grown, and the audience has gone up and down, depending on the topics. But I appreciate anyone who takes their time to listen to one of these episodes, to listen to what I have to say, and in the case of the call-ins, what others have to say. And I hope you're getting enjoyment out of it, and I hope if you do have thoughts about the podcast, you'll let me know. It doesn't have to be anything. You don't have to be part of the podcast. You just say, hey, this is just for you. But I have a question, or I have an idea or an opinion that I'd like to express, and that can just be between us. But thanks to everyone that has ever touched on this podcast. And I'm going to stop talking now, because I've been going on way too long. But thank you all again. And for all the people that called in, if you're interested in their podcasts that they have, and they all have one, all that information is going to be in the show notes. And I hope that you'll give them your attention, because they certainly deserve it. So until next time. The opening music of this podcast is Strength of the Titans, and the closing music is Late Night Radio, both by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. Thank you for listening to Phantom Thoughts. I would love to hear your feedback. You don't have to be part of the show. If you want to contact me and let me know, hey, these are for your eyes only, I just wanted to give you thoughts, ideas, response, and it's really for your eyes or ears only, that's absolutely fine. I'd love to hear from you either way. So just let me know when you contact me. Just, I don't want to be part of the show. There are lots of different ways you can contact me. You can send me an email at phantomthoughtspodcast@gmail.com. And that can be a regular email, or you can attach an audio file to it. you can use the message button on my podcast site on podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/phantom thoughts. You can contact me via my Google Voice number, 864-209-1441. You can contact me via SpeakPipe at www.speakpipe.com/phantom thoughts. You can contact me on Discord, The Pink Phantom. All this contact information is listed in the show notes of every episode. And thank you for those who call in. Thank you for those who don't call in. I appreciate you listening and hope you'll listen again next time. Until then, I hope you have a great day.